So, hi, and welcome to Do We Even Need Flex Anymore? I'm just going to come straight out and say it. Yeah, we still do need Flex. So, today we're going to talk about different CSS layout modes and when and how to use each of them. So, a CSS layout mode controls how the direct children of an element are laid out relative to that element. And it can also give you access to some additional properties. So, for instance, the gap property is only available in grid and flex. There's a bunch of different layout modes. These are the ones we're going to look at today: normal flow, float, multi-column layout, table layout, flexible box layout, and grid layout. Flexible box layout is, of course, Flexbox's full name that its mum calls it when she's mad at it. If you'd like to read more about these, as always, I'd suggest checking out MDN, but we're going to start off with normal flow. So normal flow is the default layout of the web. It's what you get if you don't do any of these other things, and it's intended for laying out text. So if you have a site that is more content focused rather than app focused, like this recipe site, then you're probably going to use a lot of normal flow. So this is all laid out entirely in normal flow, and same with this picture book, this children's book, which is a combination of text and images. But even if you have an app that is more app-based, you're still going to use normal flow for situations where you do have text. So for instance, this Reddit post, the post as a whole is laid out using normal flow. Then the stuff across the top is laid out using grid. The buttons along the bottom are laid out using flex. And the actual content of the post is again laid out using normal flow. If you're wondering what the vegetable looks like, it's not whatever you were thinking. It's a duck. It's cute. If you want to learn more about normal flow, I actually have another talk about this, so you can check that out. But let's move on to some other options for laying out text in slightly more interesting ways. So the first of those is float. You might be surprised to hear me talking about float because you might think that that's an obsolete layout that we don't need anymore. You're partially right. So there's a bunch of stuff that we used to use float for, mostly around putting things next to each other, that we don't need to use float for anymore because we have grid and flex and they are much better at it. But that was never really the intended purpose of float, and float is still the best and sort of only way to achieve its intended purpose. Its intended purpose is to have text flow around things. So if we revisit our storybook from earlier, this layout is, oh, look, it's boring. It's just text, image, text, image, text, image. It's very plain. So we can make this a little bit more interesting by introducing float. If we put a float on this image here, so now the text flows around the image. The whole thing is a little bit more comprehensive, cohesive, and I think it's just a little bit nicer. You should also note that the float takes inline start and inline end now, so we can use logical properties rather than left and right. It doesn't stop here though. Float gets even more exciting than this. We can combine float with clip path and shape outside to have text flow around any shape that we can imagine. Well, any shape that we can define with an SVG path. I've gone with circle because I'm not very exciting, but you can do anything you like. All right, the next option we have for jazzing up our text layout is multi-column layout. So multi-column layout is intended for laying out text like columns in a newspaper. If you don't remember what a newspaper looks like, it's something like this. So we can create a layout like this using just the columns property. So we can either pass in the number of columns we want. So if we've got 3, we could do 9, but that is clearly way too many. Or we can pass in how wide we want the columns to be, and we'll just get as many as fit. Or we can pass in both, and the browser will kind of work out whatever the best compromise is there. It doesn't stop there though. We can also do exciting things like style the space between the columns. So we can say here that we want this to be lime instead, or lime green, because apparently those are 2 different colors. And we can also have elements that span across all of the columns using column span all. One thing to be aware of if you are using columns on the web though is to ensure that the content is going to fit entirely within the viewport, because nobody wants to have to scroll up and down between columns. Also, full disclosure, Paramount Plus doesn't actually use column layouts. For this kind of thing, I just made this up because I couldn't find a real example of column layouts on the web. So if you've got an example, I'd love to hear it. And if you don't have an example, maybe you could add an example. Column layouts are cool. You should use them. All right, so moving on from text-based layouts to table layouts. So table layouts are another one that have a bit of a checkered history. Way back in the early days of the web, we just kind of used table layouts for, everything. Then at some point we thought, wouldn't it be better if HTML was semantic? And maybe we shouldn't lay out everything using tables. And then there was this weird backlash where everyone was like, no, don't use tables. Tables are terrible. Hopefully by now, though, we've reached that happy medium where we've recognized that while we shouldn't lay everything out with tables, they definitely have a time and place. And that is for laying out tabular data. So tabular data is data that's laid out in a grid where either each column represents an entity and each row represents a property of that entity. So here each column is a pricing plan and each row is something about that pricing plan, like how many screens you get. Or we can have each row be an entity and each column be a property of the entity. So here each row is an email and each column is something about that email, like the sender or the date it was received. Can I just say though, I am super disappointed in my spam box. I thought I'll grab an example of table out of my spam box and it'll be hilarious because it'll be full of very inappropriate things like ladies who really want to meet me and offers to increase the size of certain body parts. And there's nothing. This is just stuff that Gmail thought I wouldn't want to look at for some reason, and I'm not even sure why for some of it. So yeah, spam boxes, nowhere near as fun as they used to be. This is not a table. I mean, it has tables in it, but not that kind of table, but it's not a table layout. There's no sort of row or column here that refers to a single entity. Instead, this is just a grid layout with cards in it. If you do want to create a table layout, you should use the HTML table element. There is a way to do table layouts just using CSS, but I'm not going to tell you what it is because you shouldn't do it. Just use the HTML element. It has a bunch of accessibility baked in. If you use it, it's going to make your life easier and it's going to be a better experience for your users. Okay, so that brings us to the real star of our show, Grid and Flex. So Grid and Flex are our sort of more customizable layouts. They're the things that we're going to use for those non-traditional pages, which are more app-like rather than more content-based. But even if you do have a content-based site, there's not really any reason not to use Grid and Flex if that's how you need to achieve the look that you're going for. There are some things that you can only do with Grid, and there are definitely some things that you can only do with Flex. But there is a lot of overlap between them, and I think what we all really want to know is how to decide which one to use without having to use both of them and then compare them to see which one's better. Unfortunately, there is no simple answer for that, or rather there is a simple answer, but it depends, and people don't like it when you say that for some reason. So instead, we're going to have a look at our layouts through the lens of this little framework here. So what we're concerned with is who's controlling the layout. There's two aspects to that. They are intertwined to some extent, but I think it's worth thinking about both of them. So the first is the developer controlling the layout or is the browser controlling the layout? When the developer controls the layout, we specify exactly how big we want each element to be and exactly where on the page we want it to be. When the browser controls the layout, we just give it the HTML and it figures it out for us. The advantage of the developer controlling the layout is that we know exactly what's going on. We know exactly where everything's going to be. It's going to match our Figma designs better, or more predictably. Whereas when the browser controls things, we don't necessarily know in advance what it's going to look like. However, the browser makes things responsive by default. So if the browser is controlling the layout, then it's guaranteed that your content will be visible regardless of how much there is and what size the viewport is. So in an ideal world, we want the browser to do as much of that as possible because doing it, like adding that responsiveness as a developer, is a lot more work. So in an ideal world, we want the browser to take as much control as possible and we want the developer to just do the minimum, right? We're busy people. The other aspect of this is, does the parent control the layout or do the children control the layout? So when the parent controls the layout, like in a grid layout, we specify a bunch of slots that exist in the parent, and then the children are laid out relative to those slots. If a child element is too big, it's going to overflow its slot, but it's not going to affect the layout of the other children, right? They'll just overlap on top of each other, but the next child will still be laid out relative to its slot with no movement there. If the children control the layout, then each child is just laid out sort of after the previous child. If one child is too big, it's not going to overflow on top of the next child. Instead, it's going to change the position of all of the subsequent children. And then the last child in the row is the one that's going to overflow out of the container. Okay, so with that in mind, let's have a look at a couple of examples. And we're going to start with the buttons on our Reddit post. Now, I know I already said that these are laid out with Flex, but let's go through the exercise anyway. So what we have here is a small number of buttons. We're not sure exactly how many. It could be different in different situations. But it's always going to be a small number. So we're confident that they're all going to fit in one row. Each button is just going to be as big as it needs to be to fit its content, and we just want each button to sit immediately after the previous button with a bit of a gap in the middle there, in between them there. This is very much a Flex layout. This layout is 100% controlled by the browser. Like as a developer, we're not really saying anything about how we want these buttons to be laid out. And it is 100% controlled by the children. The position of each element only depends on the size of the previous element and how much gap we've said we want. And you can see this if we compare the implementations in Grid and Flex. So the Flex layout is literally just display Flex and we're done. The Grid layout is a bit longer, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. There are definitely situations where longer is better. In this case though, we've got this. So this is Grid Autoflow Column. What this means is it's a grid layout where each new element is added to the same row rather than starting a new row. And we need it in this situation because we don't know how many buttons there are. It is a perfectly valid grid property, but it's not one that people use very often. So this layout is weird. If we want to follow like the principle of least surprise in our code, this code is very surprising. If we want to create this layout, then don't just use Flex. It's going to be better for everyone. And I think this holds true even when the layout flips around to vertical. So this is a date range picker. In large containers, it's going to be horizontal like this. And in small containers, it's going to flip around and be vertical. This time, the Flex layout is, the Flex implementation is longer, but it's still better. So the Flex version is display Flex, Flex direction column. Anybody who understands Flex is going to know exactly what that means. The Grid version, though, is just display Grid. This is shorter, but it's also weirder. Like, if I look at this as someone who uses Grid a fair bit, I'm going to say, did they forget to put in the Grid template columns? Is Grid template columns defined somewhere else? Is this not, in fact, a grid layout, and someone just forgot to delete some CSS that they were trying to clean up? All right, this one, even though the Flex is longer, it's better. It's less surprising. Stick with the Flex version. Okay, so what happens if the developer wants to exert a little bit of control here? So this time we have the same small number of buttons, just like we had in the Reddit post. Again, we don't know exactly how many there are, but it's a small number, and we just need each one to be as big as it needs to be to fit its content. This time, though, we also have this text at the start, which is a title, and the title is just going to stretch out to take up whatever space is left over from the buttons. So this time the developer is exerting a little bit of control, but it's still mostly the browser and it's still entirely the children. So we're going to stick with Flex. We can implement this in Flex by adding a display Flex to the container and then saying that we want the first child of that container to grow and take up the available space. We can also do this with Grid, but we need display Grid, so that's fine. We've got Grid Autoflow Column, which we've already said is weird. And then I've got this Grid template columns 1FR, which is so weird that the second time I ran through my slides, I looked at this and was like, what was I doing? So the reason we do this is actually like grid template columns, 1FR, and then auto for as many buttons as we have. But because we don't know how many buttons there are, we can't put all the autos in. So instead we just put 1FR, which makes it look like it's a grid with just one column, but it's actually a grid with all the columns, and it's hard to understand and we don't like it. So we should just, well, actually, I wouldn't even use the Flex implementation of this for this particular case because it's brittle. So this layout is actually the title on a dashboard in Jira. And in some situations, the title of a gadget in a dashboard in Jira. And in some situations, a gadget becomes draggable. Like we can drag and drop it around the screen. We indicate that by adding this drag handle. As soon as we do this, our title is no longer the first element. And if we'd use that Flex layout or the grid layout, it would now be broken. Fortunately, in the Flex version, this is very easy to fix. We can just add FlexGrow1, and instead of giving it to the first child, we can say we specifically want the element that has a class of title to grow, right? This is fixed, it's fine. We can't do this with grid. Because in grid, the parent is defining the layout by creating these slots. There's no way to say that I want a specific element to grow to take up the available space, regardless of which slot it's in. We can only say that we want a specific slot to grow regardless of which element is in it. So this one we can't do in grid, it has to be Flex. There is a version of this that we can do with grid though. So this menu layout, it's got the same kind of situation as our gadget in that we've got this text that we want to take up the available space. But this time, if the icon isn't there, we just want to leave a gap, right? So that our text is always aligned. So this time, the developer is taking a lot more control. We're saying how big we want that first icon to be, and we're saying what position we want the text to be in. The parent is also taking a lot of control here because we're creating those slots for the children to go in, and we're specifying how big and where they are. The children get a little bit of a look in because the price at the end, the slot for that is just going to be as big as it needs to be for its content, but it's mostly the parent. So we can implement this using grid. We do use grid template columns to specify how big we want all of our slots to be. And then we can use grid template areas to specify which elements go in which slots. Like the technical name for these slots is like grid cells, but slots make sense to me. We can't do this in Flex because Flex layouts are controlled by the children. You can only specify the position of an element relative to the other children. So I can't say that I want that title element to be a certain distance from the parent, like whether or not there's another element in between them, right? If there's another element in between, then it's going to affect the position of the title element or the name element. All right, so this one we can't do in Flex. It has to be grid. This is actually a slightly more complicated layout because it does flow onto multiple rows. So let's have a look at some more multi-row layouts. This is a description of a knitting pattern from the site Ravelry. The pattern itself is called the Emotional Support Chicken. If you want to go make one of those, they are very cute. And the tags are just different aspects of a knitting pattern. I promise they make sense if you're a knitter. The tags are added by users, so we don't know how many there's going to be. There could be any number, so they could flow onto multiple rows. We want each tag to just be as big as it needs to be to fit its content in it, and we just want them to be one after the other. The content, as I said, can flow onto multiple rows depending on what the content is and how big the container is. And when it does flow onto multiple rows, we want them to just keep with that sort of organic flow, right? We don't want things to be lined up necessarily between the first row and the second row. So this takes us right back down the Flex end of things. This layout is completely controlled by the browser. As the developer, we're not having any real input. And it's mostly controlled by the children. The parent has a little bit of a say, I guess, because the width of the parent is going to control the point where they wrap, but it's mostly the children. We can implement this in Flex using display flex wrap, which you try saying that 10 times fast. But yeah, it's a very simple Flex layout. We can't do this one in grid. In grid, we either have to say how many columns we want per row, or we have to say how large each column is going to be. We can't just say as many as will fit, you figure it out. On top of that, if we did do this with a grid layout, then the elements in the second row would be aligned with the elements in the first row, like in a grid. And that's not what we wanted, right? So this one has to be flex. What if we add a little bit more control by the developer here? So in this layout, we still have just as many elements as fit in a row, but we're specifying exactly how wide we want each card to be. And this one is sort of exactly, I'm on the fence about this one. It could go either way. So it's sort of half controlled by the developer and half by the browser, because the developer's saying how wide each element should be, but the browser's saying where they go. And whether it's controlled by the parent or the children just depends on how you implement it. So for instance, we can implement this in Flex by using display flex wrap on the container, and then specifying that we want each direct child of that container to have a specific width. Or we can do it with grid by saying we want a grid, and we want the grid to have as many columns as will fit, and the columns to be this specific width. I personally prefer the grid layout, but if you asked me to review a PR with the Flex layout, I wouldn't ask you to change it. The reason that I prefer the grid layout is that the layout is right there. Everything you need to know is explicitly in that one place. There's no way that there could be other CSS somewhere else overwriting this. You know exactly what's going on. The downside of the grid layout is that nobody remembers the difference between autofit and autofill, and you have to look that up every time. Okay, but what if we make this a bit more flexible? So this time we want two different sizes of cards. We want a small card for series that was shot in standard def, and a large card for series that was shot in high def. We can still do this with grid, but it's starting to get a bit weird because we have to do this grid column span situation, which is easier to show than try and describe with words. So here, if we turn on our grid annotation, hopefully you can see that instead of each card being a single column, now the small cards span across 3 columns and the large cards span across 4 columns. And this works, and it's okay in this situation where there's a simple ratio between the two sizes, and it would probably be good in a situation where that ratio was important, I guess, but it is probably more complicated than it needs to be. If we did this in Flex, instead, all we can do is just specify for give each card a class and give it a width based on that class. The Flex version is a lot more flexible. We can add as many different sizes as we want, and they don't have to have any sort of specific relationship between them. If they did have a specific relationship between them, we could specify that using calc, but yeah, in this particular situation, the Flex version is better. What if we flip that on its head? So now instead of having as many cards as will fit, we want to have a specific number of cards of any width. So this is the game Connections from the New York Times. Highly recommend if you need to waste time, I guess. It is fun. And this game is always played on a 4x4 grid. So this time, it's still shared between the developer and the browser. The developer saying, I want there to be 4. The browser's to figuring out how wide each one is. But this time, the layout is 100% controlled by the parent. If there was a word that was really long so that it didn't fit inside its card, it would overflow onto the next card. It wouldn't affect the layout of the rest of the grid. This one needs to be in grid. So this is how you make 4 equal width columns in grid. I guess I'm sorry. I didn't write the spec. This is just how it is. And we can't do this one in Flex. There's no way to say that I want a specific number of elements in a row in Flex without adding additional HTML to specify the rows. And this brings me to like my one actual probably hard and fast rule, which is that if you need a 2D layout, so if you're creating a layout where things are aligned both vertically and horizontally, then just use grid. It's going to save you a bunch of hassle. And the reason for that is that the browser only has one trick if you ask it to control a multi-row layout. And that trick is line boxes. So if the browser needs to create a multi-row layout, inside of the container, it's going to create these little mini containers, which in normal flow, they're called line boxes. In Flex, they're called flex boxes. It's the same basic concept though. So each of these mini containers, these flex boxes, is going to contain one row of content, and we're going to lay the content out relative to the flex box, right? So when an item is laid out in a flex box, it's laid out relative to that flex box. The flex box controls its layout. There's no way to have items in a separate flex box affect the layout of each other, right? So the items in the first row can't affect the layout of the items in the second row, so you can't align them. I think a good demonstration of this is what happens if we grow these elements. So if we add a flex grow of 1, you'll see that the elements in the second row grow a lot more than the elements in the first row because there was more like empty space in that flex container, in that flex box. So they can't affect each other in any way. The other thing about flex boxes is that they can run horizontally like this, or they can run vertically using flex direction column, but you can't have both directions inside a single container. So if you have a layout that needs to use multiple directions, then you need to add an additional container every time you need to change directions. So an example of that is this modal that we have in Jira. You can see it's laid out vertically between the header and the rest of the content, but then it's laid out horizontally between our list of charts and the remaining content, and then it's laid out vertically between the chart preview and the footer. We can do this in Flex, but because we keep changing directions, we have to add all these additional containers and we end up with this sort of nested structure. The CSS, like, no one part of the CSS is particularly complicated, but because we have this nested structure, to understand the CSS, you have to keep the whole hierarchy of the HTML in mind, which means that this is hard to understand. It's also hard to change. So if we decided that we wanted the footer, instead of just being on the right-hand side, to stretch out across the entire bottom of the footer, we would have to change our HTML structure. We'd have to move things around in those containers, maybe use a different set of containers, and we'd have to change the CSS in some way that I didn't bother figuring out because I just implemented this in Grid. When we implement it in Grid, we don't need any additional elements. We can just use the elements that we need for that particular semantic situation. The CSS is a bit more complicated or a bit longer, but again, I think it's fine because it's longer because it's more explicit. So we're explicitly saying that these are the sizes of the slots that we want to have, and then we can use grid template areas to say which elements go in which slot. And when we use grid template areas like this, we're basically just drawing a map of what we want the layout to look like. Even someone who doesn't understand grid could probably look at this and have a fairly good idea of how this modal is going to end up looking. So this is very easy to understand. It's also easy to change. If we wanted to change the footer so that it stretched out across the whole bottom of the container, all we would have to do, the only change we'd have to make is where this says gadgets, change it to say footer. Okay, so one thing that kind of falls out of all of this is that we tend to use grid for higher level things and flex for lower level things. So we're going to use grid to describe the layout of our modal, whereas we're more likely to use flex for something like the layout of the buttons in the footer. We're more likely to use flex inside of grid than grid inside of flex. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it is how it usually ends up working out. So hopefully with this in mind and with our little framework to think about, this is going to make it easier for you to choose between grid and flex, especially if you're the kind of developer who always starts with flex and then just switches to grid when it gets too complicated. No shade, we have definitely all done that. Hopefully this will give you the confidence to, when it's appropriate, just start with grid and save yourself a bunch of time. I've been Erin Zimmer. The slides are up at flex.ez.codes if you want to have a look. And yes, this slide is absolutely laid out using float. Thank you very much.